Hello everybody, welcome along. I'm your friendly host Gareth. I present the technology programme Digital Planet on the BBC World Service. I also do other bits of podcasting and stuff, but that's enough about me. Let's jump straight in. And of course, what a year it has been. We have seen medical research, scientific research at breakneck speed, at warp speed. So what can we learn? And also today, we're going to be talking about the most important people in clinical research. And that's ordinary people like you and me taking part in clinical trials. So what is a clinical trial? And also, how are clinical trials moving forward as technology and innovation move on? So lots to get into today with an all-star cast. We have some amazing guests for you in this session. And these are people who are going to really take us into the heart of today's cutting edge biomedical research. So let's meet them really quickly. First of all, Christina Duran, who is Chief Digital Health Officer in Research and Development at AstraZeneca. So Christina, your job title includes the word digital health. What is digital health?
So yes, hi Gareth and hi everyone. Digital health is the convergence of data, digital and analytics with healthcare, and with the aim to improve healthcare outcomes. So a similar revolution that we've seen in other industries now coming to healthcare.
All right, Christina, nice to meet you. Now, we also have Hugh Montgomery here, who's a professor of intensive care at University College London at UCL. So Hugh, as we go along, we're going to talk a lot about your research in clinical trials, in working with researchers and with pharmaceutical companies in clinical trials. But you are a frontline doctor. And I just have to ask you, the pandemic, what has it been like?
I suppose it's been in equal measure emotionally and physically very exhausting. But it's also been exciting and challenging. I mean, the chance to meet and treat and try to understand a completely new disease is something that for most people doesn't happen in a lifetime. So interesting and challenging.
Right, I'm sure. Well, we really appreciate you taking time out of the clinic to talk to us in this session. Now, we also have Michelle Longmire here. When I say here, I mean there. She's all the way over in Silicon Valley. So very excited to have you with us in this session. So Michelle is a physician herself and also the CEO of Medable. And because you're in the Valley, I kind of want to call you a startup, but you're also quite big. So are you a startup? And just in a few words, what do you do?
Sure. So I think by Silicon Valley terms, we're certainly still a startup. But what we do is we provide a platform to connect people to clinical trials so they can access the new medicines that are available in the clinical trials. And as you said, Gareth, participate in this critical research, which helps us get new medicines to the world. And we do this in a way that weaves directly into our daily lives, opens access to everyone ideally, and really makes it more convenient and accessible, and ideally also faster and efficient. So that's what we do at Medable. We're a technology company and really excited for today's conversation.
All right, Michelle, good to meet you. Now, last but by no means least, let's meet Nick Hartshorne-Evans, who's CEO of the Pumping Marvellous Foundation. So you're a heart failure charity, or maybe, Nick, should I call you the heart failure charity? You're the prominent one, the biggest one here in the UK. Can we say that?
You can. We are the most prominent in the UK. We are the only heart failure, patient-led heart failure charity in the UK. And this is sort of replicated globally as well, because there doesn't seem to be many patient advocacy groups across regions or the globe who look at heart failure, unlike other long-term conditions like cancer and diabetes.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that you're here, because we're going to hear today, this is all about having the patient right at the heart of medical innovation and indeed clinical trials. So that's going to be very much your side of things, Nick. Just very quickly before we move on, though, I was reading your biog earlier on, and you said that you and Barack Obama have something in common, but you never said what it is. Are you allowed to tell us in this session?
To be honest with you, I can't believe I've left that in for the biog on this, but I can tell you. So Crane's Business Magazine, which is a long-standing, I don't know whether it's still going actually, out of Chicago, New York, certainly based in the US, came over to the UK, to Manchester in the 2000s. And I was one of the inaugural 40 under 40 Crane's Business Award winners. I think it was in 2008. I think Crane's Business lasted about 3 years in Manchester and decided to hop back over the pond. But yeah, Barack Obama was a was a Crane's under 40 winner in Chicago, along with Oprah Winfrey as well. So, but I didn't put that in. So that was it, really.
You've gone far, haven't you? All right, Nick, good to meet you. Right, so let's get into this then. And first of all, I just want to get into clinical trials themselves, what they are. And perhaps, Hugh Montgomery, you can help me with this because you spend every day of your life with patients, many of whom are enrolled on clinical trials. And my very layperson's understanding is that maybe there's a new medicine or a new treatment coming out, and you want some people to be given this new treatment, other people not to be given it, so you've got a comparison group or a control, as you call it. And that's the sum total, the extent of my knowledge of clinical trials. So pick it up from there for me, Hugh. What is a clinical trial?
Well, in many ways, you're not actually wrong. In the origins of medicine, I suppose, there was always anecdote. An anecdote took us quite a long way. People tried one thing, ate one thing, found they got better and didn't, and started adopting things. But of course, the problem is that humans are very good at confirmation bias. We do something, we like to attribute a benefit to it or a harm to it, and sometimes that's not there at all. We can all get a herd mentality where we all think that something's working or not, and we actually in the end have to prove whether or not it works. So the only way to do that really is to do a trial and to test it. So trials can take a lot of forms, and Astra will tell you far more about that than I, but it goes from cell work and potentially animal work, then to first into humans, just to show what the doses are like, what the absorption's like, where the drug gets in, how long it lasts for, and then safety trials to make sure nothing awful happens when you're taking the drug, and then on into the trial to actually show whether it has an impact at all on the disease that you're interested in. And that requires the right number of patients, the right type of patients, and usually blinding, so that the patient and the person running the trial doesn't know who's getting what, to make sure bias doesn't creep in. But there have been big developments in the last few years, actually, so things are changing fast.
That is great. And that's a great place to bring you in, Christina. Things are changing fast. And Hugh said there that clinical trials take lots of different forms, an increasing number these days. So how is the clinical trial developing?
So the clinical trials obviously take a long time, as Hugh was saying before. But also they were being run historically in a similar way that healthcare is run. So we would ask a patient to go to the physician, make sure that they were providing the information at the physician's office or the hospital. And because it's a clinical trial, you want to have quite a lot of data. So they were asking patients to go many times to the hospital to provide more data. And it was quite intensive, they ask for patients to participate. In some studies, you could be asking, come every 2 weeks to the hospital, but then you need to go, you need to park, you need to spend time in the waiting room. So it's just very, very heavy on from a patient perspective. And only 3% of eligible patients actually agree to participate on a clinical trial. So it's not that there is lots of people that want to participate, and one of the barriers is how easy is to participate on a clinical trial. So one of the things that we, before the pandemic, for example, when you ask patients, they want some flexibility. Could we join the clinical trial, but could we provide some of this information from home? Do we really need to go through so many of these visits? So listening to patients and putting the patient at the center, they were pretty right. And actually through the pandemic, we've seen that it is possible to do obviously quite a lot of these things differently. So the whole of healthcare is changing. And some of the things that we were doing before the pandemic has been accelerated through the pandemic.
Right, okay, yeah, so lots of different ways of innovating apart from anything, so the patient doesn't perhaps need to come to the clinic as often, so there's a load of technology coming in there, and we're going to explore much more of this. But I want to come to you now, Nick, as our patient representative here in this session. And what I want to know is, what's in it for the patient? We've already heard that patient recruitment is a challenge, and I know you're going to get that nice, warm, fuzzy feeling as a clinical trial volunteer that you're helping in medical research. But apart from that, you're going to get prodded and poked. You've got to turn up to the clinic. You don't even know if you're going to get the actual medicine and get any benefit from the treatment. Why do people do it?
Well, I think they do it for many reasons. But I would say there are a couple of key sort of commonalities there. The first one being altruism, that a lot of people want to give back into the system. And, that adds significant value going forward, and they can see that. The other benefit would be that they are, if they're in a clinical trial, they are optimized, certainly in heart failure, with the care that they get and the access, and that's very important. And I would say that people are also intrigued as well around clinical trials. But I would say the top two elements there are altruism, feeding back into the system, adding value. They know potentially where their treatments have come from, which are clinical trials many years ago, and also the second point as well. So.
Yeah, and I'm sure in many cases there are patients who'd be disappointed not to be in a trial. They put themselves forward and perhaps they don't fit the eligibility criteria. I can imagine in a lot of cases they'd be very sad not to be able to take part.
Yeah, I think managing expectations is a key with clinical trials, and you know what? Certainly since the start of the pandemic, at the start of last year, the knowledge, or the layperson's knowledge of clinical trials has increased dramatically, and that has actually been that's a real opportunity that we should be jumping on. But also the understanding that clinical trials have a purpose at the end. It's not just about people wanting to being scientists and finding out about them. There is a purpose behind it, and it's good that the pandemic has the clinical trials that have rapidly happened since last year have actually produced some results, and that's really important as well.
Yeah. And I'm sure, Michelle Longmire, that must have a positive feedback effect. When people out there see that we have these, in this case during the pandemic, these really fast-track trials, and we're getting results, and people are superheroes for taking part, that must help make the case for people to step forward and want to take part in clinical trials.
Yeah, I think it's really an unprecedented opportunity for clinical research to be advanced, because now there's this broad awareness of the importance. And I think also, people participate in clinical trials because they want access to a new medicine. And so, right now, I think we're going to have the biggest breakthroughs in the next decade in clinical research, of those all former decades combined. And I think it's going to be driven by an awareness of research across the world that's never really, been at this height. And then I think secondarily, we've shown we can do this faster. We've shown we can make progress over really unimaginable timelines. And I think this raises the bar. I make the comparison, it's like running the 4-minute mile. Once it's done you see that humanity can understand the possibility, and you start to run the 4-minute mile all over the world. So, I think that this is an unprecedented time for patients to understand the importance, the access it provides to new medicines, and, to the point earlier from Nick, the value it provides to everyone living with these conditions in the participation of clinical trials.
And we're going to hear a lot more from you and Christina about the biotech revolution and how that's one of many forces really speeding up medical research. But before we fully jump into the future and indeed the present, Hugh, can I come back to you and just get a sense, maybe traditionally, what clinical trials have involved, maybe in the pre-digital era? And am I right in thinking it will be people in white coats with clipboards going around bedsides taking notes? How has it happened in the past? And once we understand that, then of course we can move in and see how it's now innovating.
Well, things are really changing, and they're changing very, very much for the better at the warp speed that Michelle's just described to us. So heaven forbid, back in the day, I was someone who helped do drug trials, and it was tedious. The first thing was, as we've heard, a real lack of inclusivity. So if you happened to have ovaries or a menstrual cycle, you were basically excluded because my word, didn't they get in the way. So it was just men. And it was only men who happened to have the spare time to be able to come up to hospital clinic regularly. And a very small subgroup was selected, and you collected only small amounts of data exactly described on a clipboard or a paper form, which meant the amount of data you could get was limited. Things were missed out. There weren't electronic records, so there were gaps in those records. You could only see people every few weeks. The lengths of the trials had to be relatively short. And you looked at the end for a p-value. So this is a statistical test to say, do we think this works? And without going into it, a p-value of less than 0.05 was said to say, yes, something works. Well, that's changed. In the last few years now, we try to make sure that women and men are equally represented, that different races are represented. We try to focus on interest to patients, because what might be of interest to me as a doctor that I think is important to Nick might be totally irrelevant. It may not be the thing he wants treated at all. Also, p.05 means that you've got a 95% chance that your drug was effective. Just because it's p.06, 94%, does that really mean that it's not effective? It just means that it's 94% chance. So we've changed our thoughts about the statistics, and also we've embraced variability, because what we used to do was give a whole bunch of people a drug, and we'd say some of them are doing this and getting better, and some of them are doing that and getting it worse, and some in the middle, and we'd add it all up and do some averaging and go, oh, on average, people aren't better. But you could look and see a whole group of people that seemed to be dramatically responding, and we used to throw that in the bin and ignore it, and we're not. And the opportunity for digital crosses all of this. It allows us to recruit people, access people, as we'll hear from our other speakers, how to connect doctors and researchers and drug companies with patients, and how to recruit them and get lots and lots of data in real time about things that really matter to those patients, and do clever statistical analysis with machine learning and artificial intelligence to find the signals we couldn't see before. So this is a really exciting time, I think, to be involved.
Right, okay, so we have data, we have artificial intelligence, and Christina, I mean, it is incredible the pace of progress that we've seen in the last year, because I'd have thought, my view would be that it takes maybe 10 years to go from the molecule, as it were, right up to a treatment. But what's happened over the last year has changed that perception of how long it all takes. So what has gone on then? What's enabled it? We've already heard about AI, for instance. So what are these enabling factors?
Yeah, so if you look across, obviously different, across the industry, it is between 7 to 10 years between molecule to, getting the medicine to patients. Through the pandemic, you've seen, and vaccines also, the median of vaccines, identifying a vaccine is 10 years in history. If you look at, historical vaccines, and COVID vaccines now have been in less than a year, being identified. Now, could all in future be, as fast as the vaccines? I think is, even within the organization, it was, a Herculean effort, as well as obviously innovation that went into it and running lots of things in parallel at the same time. A crisis like the pandemic will accelerate innovation, and I think there is a lot of things of the learning on that innovation. The first one is putting the patient first. So I think that acceleration, if you're really focused on, what are we trying to solve for, making sure that the question that we're trying to answer for that patient is simplified, let's making those clinical trials quite simple, and making it easier for the patients to participate, both to join, participate, and to collect that data. That would obviously accelerate as well a lot. But it's not as simple. So Gareth, I was going to get into, it's not that simple as putting a device or an app, putting it into a clinical trial, and ta-da, you have amazing data to do scientific research. Because many of those devices or those tools are not, they are not rigor enough to provide that answer. So I do want to balance some of the discussions on, now with digital and data and AI, we can do amazing things. This is healthcare and human beings, so we just need to make sure that it's very, very rigorous and very accurate when we're making those studies. So we do need to balance, and that's why it has come to healthcare a bit later than other industries, because we just need to be careful.
And I'm very glad you said that, because so many of us now have these consumer electronics devices that measure our heart rate and lots of other biosigns. And at $20 or $30 a pop, I guess these are not proper, full-on, clinically approved devices. They might be useful, but they're not the whole story by any means. So
yes, many of the devices need to be clinical validated. So you cannot take any device where the algorithm would change in the, they just change the algorithm through the clinical trial. So then you have different data at the beginning of the trial and then subsequently at the end of the trial. So we do need to review not only the clinical trial, how it would run, but also making sure that each of the different tools or devices or solutions, they are, rigorous in its components. So the data that can be collected is doesn't change through the study. It can be accurately be collected, etc. So it's just, that was the point, Gareth, that I was trying to make sure that we do take those things into consideration. And in the market, there are many, many different devices. Some are absolutely not clinically validated, and then there is obviously a smaller number where they do have that clinical validation.
That note of caution very much noted. Let's come back to you, Michelle, because over at Medable, where you are, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, your company is about the decentralized clinical trial. So first of all, how are clinical trials centralized in the first place? What does that mean? And then what do you mean through this decentralized approach?
Sure, that's a great question. So, decentralized is referencing the former point or I should say status quo of centralized, which is around the clinic, and decentralized is not around the clinic. Another way to say it is that it's decentralized is patient-centered, where the patient is at the center of the strategy in terms of how we engage, the value we provide, and also how we collect the majority of the data. To Christina's point, what she was saying earlier is that during the quarantine, there's limited access to clinical sites. So decentralized is a very important methodology to open access from the comfort of your own home and collect that data to drive research forward. Now, a lot of the points Christina made are extremely pertinent, because now you're moving out of this very confined arena of a clinic, right, where everything can follow a very specific and set workflow with oversight, to a home. So we're relying more on the patient, of course, and also a set of devices to capture that data and relay that data. And it's critical that we do this with the same degree of rigor around the safety and efficacy and the ability to interpret the safety and efficacy. So decentralized is really patient-centered, and it's about being remote and facilitating access really from the home or anywhere that the patient is. So it's an exciting transformation. It comes with a tremendous number of considerations to be done correctly. And it's something that as an industry, we're moving forward because we think it's very important to facilitate access, in times like COVID, as well as just taking into consideration that most patients don't live near a clinical site. So many patients living with conditions are living far from where the research is executed, but they're interested in participating and they're interested in accessing these new medicines. So decentralized or patient-centered enables ideally anyone to participate from anywhere in the world. And that is really important because of the access and the way that it actually makes research faster. Because one of the things that slows research down the most is actually connecting with the person who's going to participate in the clinical trial. So it's a very exciting transformation. It comes with a tremendous number of considerations, and companies like Medable, who bring the tech, and AstraZeneca, who bring the know-how and rigorous clinical research, and investigators and doctors like Hugh and patients like Nick are all part of the equation to make this successful.
Okay, so you mentioned data, and I'm just trying to get a sense of what that data looks like. Can you give me an example then of a patient who right now sitting at home, they have some kind of technology on them? I don't know if it's their smartphone or maybe specialist medical kit that's been shipped to them so they can participate in the trial. What does that look like for the patient?
Sure. So just as an example, over 80% of patients with COVID can be managed from home. And this is something people don't really realize. And the way that actually can occur is through connectivity, where we know the patient's status in their own assessment and in the report of their health. We know their vital signs through pulse oximetry and other connected technologies for pulse, as well for the blood oxygen through pulse oximetry. We know their heart rate, and we also know their blood pressure. And this is coming through medically validated devices that are shipped to the patient, where we can collect that in home, just as one example. So yeah, it's a combination of the patient being able to report that in real time through their phone, connecting with a doctor via telemedicine, and connecting that vital sign data through sensors.
Okay, and Nick, what about you? Are you seeing that coming through now in heart failure trials? Are they becoming increasingly high tech?
I suppose this is a really good time to talk about what we've developed, because I was absolutely flabbergasted that when we ran a poll on our community and take into consideration that we do run the largest global conversations in heart failure with patients. And around 80, I can't remember exact percentages, but around 89% of patients had never been talked to about clinical trials in heart failure. And I was flabbergasted with that, absolutely. And when I hear from the other side that we're struggling and we're failing to recruit patients into clinical trials, I'm thinking something is disastrously wrong here. And what we need to do is we need to inject pace into the clinical trials recruitment process. We need to build pace into the awareness of clinical trials. But I think COVID's done that. I think the pandemic has really given it, it's put a set of ladders on, and we're not only just put a foot on the ladder, we're up a couple of rungs already without even trying. So a couple of years ago, we thought how, I've sat on guideline boards and worked with payers, and I was getting very frustrated with the cohort size has not been achieved. Obviously, statistical evidence doesn't, the statistical relevance of the trial then reduces. And so, as a patient group, as this one, this sort of patient group that speaks to lots and lots of heart failure patients on a day-to-day basis, surely we could be a conduit for that. And I had a light bulb moment. And what we did was we basically built a platform called cardiotrials.org that is a handshaking system for patients and clinical trialists. So one of the issues was that maybe the patients aren't being communicated to about clinical trials, irrespective of the type of clinical trial, but clinical trials in heart failure. And what we want to do is say, well, we represent a huge body of patients, so we're going to build a patient registry that's interested in heart failure. And on the other side, we're going to allow, and I mean allow, medical researchers to put their trials and get them to connect. And once they're connected, through a handshaking process of a couple of points, what that would do would bolster the traditional recruitment style or recruitment methods in clinical trials. And we launched it back end of last year, cardiotrials.org, and there are massive opportunities to expand how we do that as well by introducing technologies, not just the matching process, but also, you talk about decentralized trials. We at the start of the pandemic, we hadn't built that in. Now we've built it in as part of the development process. And we call it democratizing heart failure. So we talk about democratizing so that availability of clinical trials is open to everybody, irrespective of what their clinician may say. That actually we can put medical researchers together with patients, and that is a massive step in the right direction. And also with the pandemic and what's happened with how patients, certainly with heart failure, are being seen remotely now by their clinicians, by physicians and nurses. This just falls nicely into what I would say is the wave of technology that is going to determine how we treat and care people with long-term conditions.
Right, okay, so Hugh Montgomery, technology just coming in so much there in that dating agency approach, matching patients to clinical trials that we've heard there from Nick, but also once they're on the trial, increasingly be able to participate from home through wearable devices, through medically approved, proper devices that are connected to them, so they can participate in the trial remotely in a decentralized way in many ways. So where else do you see this going then, Hugh? What does that mean to you when you see all these technologies? And as somebody who remembers the old school clinical trials and the clipboards and the pieces of paper, what does this mean for you?
Well, I think it means a lot for the patients, actually, in the end. It will make life better for doctors too. I think it starts earlier. I think the digital and revolution, particularly with machine learning and so forth, is going to allow extraordinary drug development. The speed now with AlphaFold, which was a program to identify how proteins fold, will allow drug companies, for instance, to work out what chemicals will fit a receptor, come up with a new drug or compound really quickly. The recruitment platforms you've heard about will allow people to be identified. And it's partly through these handshake devices, which I think are absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think, Michelle and Nick's work is terrific and is the way forward. But equally, if you were able to look at the data sets within hospitals, we could readily identify patients with exactly the right characteristics. So the digital access to those platforms securely will help enormously. Then you've got the data entry, but it's not just the patient reported data. Apps now allow patients to put in things that are important to them. I'm feeling a bit more weary, I'm a little more tired, my sleep seems to be disturbed, things we might not otherwise capture. But also the granularity of the data. We used to stick a pin in someone's arm every 6 weeks. Well, now you can get every single blood test that's done because it's in the electronic record. And rather than just having a printed out piece of ECG with a waveform, you've got the noughts and ones behind it and all sorts of subtleties in that ECG that you would otherwise have missed as well, let alone the wearable technology too and the ease of communication. And then, of course, you've got the analysis as the trials are going on. So in COVID, we've had platform trials like Recovery, which have taken on these really extraordinarily quite novel ideas for us called adaptive platforms. So people are being randomized to different drugs in combination at the same time. The statistics is done in real time, and drugs that fail drop out. When drugs are shown to work, they're shown to work and another one drops in. That was revolutionary for us. We've never had experience of that in the medical world before. So, and that's worked. In COVID, we've come across already with that trial 2 effective drugs. As we've heard before, really, we're a long way up this ladder. So I think it goes from the start, from drug design, right the way through to recruitment and accumulation, interrogation of data. And this is going to accelerate even faster in the next couple of years.
Right, okay. And before we go, I want to finish by talking about the future, and goodness knows where that's going to take us into cyborg culture. I don't know what. Just before we get there, though, I am really enjoying this conversation, partly because you're all great people, but also if you look at this, we've got Nick, who is CEO of this big heart failure charity and global conversation about this serious condition. We have a drugs company person in the room here. We have a Silicon Valley startup. We have you as an emergency doctor. This surely is actually part of the way forward. A doctor like you, hearing somebody like Nick talking about what patients care about. I suppose what I'm fishing around for is the role now of collaboration and the right people and enough people being in the room when we're talking about medical innovation.
You're absolutely right. And if we go back even 5 years, we're talking about the pace of change. 5 years ago, when patient involvement in research was first mooted, it really was in some regards quite a token gesture. You'd find some patient that you might have known that might turn up, and they generally weren't that interested, probably didn't quite understand what you were talking about anyway, but it ticked the box. It's reverse polarity now. Doctors now are really asking the patients, what is it that you're suffering from? What are the things that matter to you that we need to make better? Can we work with you to achieve that? And you've only got to look at the classic example that's appeared this year, which is long COVID. That's a disease that's appeared and identified by patients. It wasn't identified by doctors, it was identified by patients. And it's the patients who got together in groups and have catalogued their symptoms. And now we as doctors and as drug companies can start understanding what patients are suffering, what they want us to address. And now we can start going back to them to say, we've got some science here that might start explaining that. Would you like to work with us? So things are transforming. You're right, this is a partnership. And my plea again is that let's get rid of some of these barriers. Let's start listening to patients as doctors and drug companies. As patients, please join in and don't be as frightened as you might have been of drug companies, because they're not. They're the people who make the things that cure you. And to make one last point, actually, to pick up something you said very early on about value to patients of being in trials. It's something we're always aware of, even if you're in the placebo limb of the trial. In other words, the doctor and you don't know what you're getting, but you're getting a chalk tablet, something that doesn't actually work. Your outcomes are almost universally better. And they're better because you're in a structured process of healthcare where people are taking every element of degree of care to make sure things are done right. So there's value to being in a trial, even if you don't get the active drug.
Well, let's now look a little bit to the future there and come back to you, Christina, as we begin to wrap up in this panel. Where is this going? So, and you of all people, you should know about this. Say you are as a chief digital health officer at the top of R&D in AstraZeneca of all places. So what do you see on the horizon?
So I may include a new example of how healthcare can change over a long period of things that are already here. So you can already test through a blood test whether you have cancer, any type of cancer. So imagine that you change the cancer care by proactively checking whether patients have cancer and then treating earlier. Today, in the normal healthcare, most cancer patients are identified at late stage, and survival rates are lower in later stage than they would be on earlier stage. So to change the whole healthcare system to proactively do it early, you do need to run the evidence that obviously those tests work. You do need to run new treatments, but you have to change the whole system. Today, you're not proactively testing for cancer in that way, and actually doing that type of a screening takes also a different attitude. Do patients that have smoked for many years, it has been proven many years ago that you should be checked for screening for lung cancer, but there is also a fear of being screened. So there is lots of new technology, lots of new availability to go earlier into the diagnostics. And I think it's a journey that it comes as a partnership, because it's a healthcare system, or the journey of a whole patient from early being diagnosed to treatment to post-treatment. It's an ecosystem of many different parties. So that's why we do need to work together on changing that positively for everyone going forward. And it takes a partnership. It is a journey. It does take a lot of research. But I think it's a really good thing to look forward to. One day when cancer is, it can be treated as many other different diseases, and we can in some ways prevent very, very difficult outcomes.
Right, there we go. Michelle, that's one vision there of much faster, much more accurate cancer diagnosis, which will of course be fabulous, and completely reliant on ever more collaboration between technology companies, drug companies, patients, hospitals, and so on. What about you? I love having these future style conversations with people in Silicon Valley, and we often end up getting very excited and talking about cyborg culture and William Gibson novels and so on. I suspect you might be a little bit more feet on the ground than that, but what can you tell me about what we see on the horizon in drug discovery and in biomedical research?
I'm so excited about this decade, because I think this is the decade of drug discovery and actually the evolution of new therapies for patients. What is exciting to me is, right now when we think of a patient, you think of yourself or you think of an individual. When you think of healthcare, clinical research, comes to mind a hospital and these big ecosystems. What I see is a world where the patient is the atomic unit, and that you are both a recipient. You can participate in clinical trials and you can receive healthcare, and that's woven into your daily life, and you can plug into healthcare ecosystems and research ecosystems, and you're the one bringing the value and the data, and that can plug in and be analyzed in a way that isn't about silos in healthcare systems, sponsors of drug companies, or individual clinical trials, but is actually the patient is this atomic unit in healthcare and in research, so that we can begin to really cross major boundaries and barriers in understanding the human health and conditions. So I think this would advance the way we receive healthcare. I think this would radically accelerate drug discovery. And I think that the need for this will emerge more quickly because of some of the complexities we're seeing in the COVID vaccine trials, is people now receive combinations of therapies that we need to research very quickly. So it's an exciting future, absolutely.
Right. So there we are. It's the diagnostics, it's the therapeutics, and Hugh Montgomery, as you look into the future, and I can't help asking, because I know you have a technology background as well as being an emergency doctor, and I keep hearing about these digital twins, for instance, the idea that you could build a virtual patient. Maybe you could build a virtual Gareth to be part of a clinical trial. Am I going completely off on some crazy sci-fi tangent there? Or is this part of where we might be going, that you can simulate the patient in order to maybe find out more about how certain treatments are going to work?
No, you're absolutely spot on. And those simulations work from basic science, which is cells. So you can construct mathematical models of the way cell pathways work, or indeed simple cells, how all of those elements work together. So that you could say, well, if I was to poke that or downregulate this or block that, what would happen to that system? People are indeed building physiological models, or for instance, how the circulation works, or indeed how organs interact, or indeed metabolism around an entire body. But then there are also these simulations about patients. So it's a way of trying to overcome the privacy problems. So could you take a representative of all of my data set that might include all the things that I might be a little bit more sensitive about and all my blood tests, and create another data set where the relationships between those variables are maintained, but they're not my actual data. That then means that you've got my so-called digital clone out there, but I'm not really a clone. I'm a different person in that data, and it helps protect a barrier. It helps mean that if someone was to go rooting around in that data set, it'd be hard for them to link those data to me because they're no longer my data. So these sorts of ways of constructing models start at sort of cellular biology up to whole human modeling, but they also allow you to take representative data sets of what would normally be healthcare data that don't, for a person that actually isn't real.
Yeah, synthetic data. Yeah. Final few words to you then, Nick. So you have the ear of people like Hugh Montgomery at UCL, you have a top startup person in Silicon Valley, you have a drug company senior person here. What are you and your patients saying to them right now? We've heard that the patient's at the center of all this. So what do you hope for in the future? What can the doctors and the drugs companies do for you? I suppose what's your message as we close this session about what you hope to see, and especially in the area that matters to you in heart failure?
Well, I'll try and answer, try and do a sort of a double answer here of questions in terms of what patients may want in the future. But I would say that, you know, I'll mirror the diagnostics piece. We have to jump on the bandwagon, certainly with heart failure, because we have a great biomarker out there that will enable us to rule out heart failure. We need to get a lot better at that, and I think the pandemic has helped that conversation. Secondly, I would say that the system has not found a way of upskilling patients' self-management and self-care well enough in heart failure. It's really, really important that the person self-manages their condition or self-cares, that whatever you want to call it. And with the plethora of opportunity that technology gives us, we can really understand and really help people live better with heart failure through better self-management. And you would have thought that would be the obvious thing to go for. You've got all the medications and the treatments and the care pathways and this and that, but actually don't just give the booklet to the patient. Ask them, do they understand it? Do they want to and engage with them? So I think that's a big step that is going to be onboarded in this decade. And the last point I will put to you is, and this is really interesting because patients tell us that quality of life, certainly in heart failure, is the most important aspect of living with heart failure. The 360 odd days of the year that they don't spend speaking to physicians, e.g. doctors and nurses. And I would challenge the validity of quality of life in clinical trials, actually. Because it's in a very, quality of life is measured through health questionnaires, and it's in a very cosseted environment where actually they're very different. The people in clinical trials, quality of life measurement is very different than it is living with the condition, not in a clinical trial. And I think we will be measuring quality of life very, very differently. I think there are masses of opportunity to measure quality of life and get a real understanding using some of the things I mentioned before around assessing what the impact of a condition around quality of life and what we need to do to make it better for the patient.
Right. Okay. Well, there we'll leave it. And I could certainly see our other three guests nodding in agreement there, where you talked about that, you know, better measurement of quality of life and that self-management aspect for patients. So it has been noted by me, and I'm sure the audience watching, that you're all taking that seriously, and that's a big part of your mission as well. And we could talk about it, but that will be here for another half an hour. So we are going to leave it there. So thank you very much for that indeed, Nick Hartshorne-Evans of the Pumping Marvellous Foundation. But you've also heard today, folks, from Michelle Longmire, who is with Medable, also Hugh Montgomery of University College London, and Christina Duran of AstraZeneca. I'm Gareth Mitchell, saying thank you very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of the Cambridge Festival, won't you? And take care of yourselves out there. Bye-bye.